Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, inspiration, and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your questions answered, and contribute to the community dialogue. There's loads of free information for experienced professionals and people just starting out on their Passive House journey. We hope to see you at one of our weekly Passive House Accelerator live webinars. In the meantime, here's this week's Passive House podcast. Welcome back to the Passive House podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler-Welsh, coming to you from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland in New Zealand, and I'm joined this week by Zach Semke. How are you doing, Zach?
I'm doing great. How are you, Matthew?
Pretty good. And we've got Ilka joining us today. Ilka Cassidy, how are you?
I'm doing well, thanks.
And so I've got a great interview, Ilka, that you did with Sandra Rohler of Cornerstone. Great to have Cornerstone back on the show and talking about a very interesting, well, a bunch of projects, but a particular co-housing project, which we'll get into very soon. But Zach, we've got some people to thank first.
We do indeed. So I want to start by giving a big shout out to Stephen Winter Associates, who is our Accelerator Partner of the Week. So a big thank you to Stephen Winter Associates for making our programming possible this week. Thank you as well to our stakeholder partner, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. Thanks too to our founding sponsors, 475 High Performance Building Supply, Ingui Architecture, Partel, Rockwell North America, and Zola Windows. And thanks to our champion sponsors, Buizo, Icon Windows and Doors, Intelligent Membranes, PH Air Seal, and Source 2050.
Awesome. Now, as I mentioned, Cornerstone, they've been around for a little while. In fact, I think you said that we've featured them on the Passive House podcast. Was it 105 or back around then?
105, yes. Scott Kennedy of Cornerstone.
Sandra has actually been on a Passive House Live as well, talking about one of the projects that we're going to be talking about today.
That's right. This co-housing project, back in 2021, she did a construction tech episode of Passive House Accelerator live with us. So we'll include links to both of those in show notes.
And so before we jump into this interview, there's a bit of terminology that we want to just check because we jump into a few things. So the first one is the ratio, the area to volume ratio. And essentially that is where you want to maximize the volume and minimize the external surface area. So I remember Cara Rosemeyer taking our course and said the best way to do that is to build your house as a sphere, which would be quite challenging. The next best option is a square box. And, some of the worst options would be things like H or U shapes where you have a lot of surface area for the same volume.
Right. That comes up in the conversation about compactness. Yep. And as Sandra refers to the AV ratio, which is the surface area to volume ratio.
And there was another one as well. Tell us about single point entry.
Yeah, So Sandra referred to single point access. You'll sometimes think single point access blocks, but essentially what that is this movement that's picking up steam. Certainly here in the Pacific Northwest and British Columbia and Seattle, and Mike Eliason, who's based in Seattle, has done a lot of writing and thinking about this. And anyway, it is the movement to allow buildings of 6 stories or less to be serviced by a single staircase rather than multiple staircases. And so it's a paradigm shift in thinking about a fire egress, and the approach includes additional fire protection measures and things. But the reason that it is catching on more and more is that it frees up space in the building. It allows for more housing and more amenity space to be available, and with the same footprint. And that's about it. That's about all I know about it, honestly.
Yeah.
But
and it relates to the previous point about surface area as well, because
that's right.
More areas that, and sometimes they're unconditioned, so you end up with more outside surface area in a block.
Right. So when Sandra, near the end of the conversation, Sandra refers to that. So when she says single point access, she's talking about servicing a building with just a single staircase.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's jump into it, and then we'll have a quick catch up on some of the other great content that she mentions during this interview.
Welcome to the Passive House podcast. Today we have Sandra Rohler from Cornerstone Architecture, who is joining us as part of our mini-series on creative approaches to increasing the housing supply. And I'm really excited to have you here for a number of reasons, Sandra, but can you first introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to work at Cornerstone?
All right. Thanks, Mary. Happy to be here. Yeah, as you said, my name's Sandra Rohler. I am an architect and trained tradesperson. Trained in Germany, moved to Vancouver, Canada in 2005. Working there as an architect now for Cornerstone Architecture. Have been working for them for the past 7 years. And other than that, I'm also teaching passive house courses, designer courses, and tradesperson courses. Yeah, I think that's it. And then one of my projects at Cornerstone Architects was a Little Mountain co-housing project, which just received passive house certification this summer.
Yeah, congratulations. That's great. Before we dive into the project, I just want to mention that you're also the co-founder of the Passive House group in Canada, correct?
Yes. Thank you. I forgot about that. Yeah, I'm a co-founder of Passive House Canada back in the days in 2013. Yeah. That is true. And I also started the Passive House tradesperson course at BCIT, also in British Columbia. Yeah.
So a lot of history and background in Passive House. So you came to the co-housing project a little bit later. So how did you come to be involved in that project? And I guess if we start from the beginning, what is co-housing? What is a co-housing development?
Mm-hmm. So I came onto this project because I was offered a job by Cornerstone after my maternity leave. I took it. They put me on the project and seemed to think I was the right fit. And I think that was correct. I really loved working on this project. To get into the other question, what is co-housing? In short, in summary, co-housing is a form of development where the clients, so the future occupants, come together and form a development company, find a site, and build a building. That now depends, the size of the building depends on how big the group is. My experience is with 25 units, 6-story building. That to me seems like a good size. It can be a bit larger, but then the community aspect might not work that well. So that was on the legal side of things, which is not the most interesting one. So what's really interesting about co-housing is rather the focus on building community. So as opposed to, I think what co-housing really wants to do is it wants to kind of get away from the rather usually isolating multi-purpose buildings, and really create a village for people by creating a lot of amenity spaces for the occupants. Everyone will have their own unit, so you can actually decide whether or not you want to kind of join the community, withdraw for a moment. So you're still autark. I don't even know if that's an English term, but then there's lots of community spaces like roof gardens, playgrounds, large kitchens where the whole group, all occupants, can cook together, have meals together, spaces where they can make music together. This project has a music room even in the basement. If you want to practice and you start out, you go into the basement. Otherwise, you're allowed to come up. They had a workshop in there, like a common laundry, I was explained to, this is very important because that's one of the meeting points. So there is a desire for community and connection to really to give everyone a purpose, right? So because we've really come from like back in the days where you had the village where you lived together, whether or not you had children or not, but like our current society really works more with smaller units. Everyone's kind of disconnected a lot of times. And yeah, I do believe that co-housing is a very, very good approach. And the 6-story building height and the roughly 25 to 30 units is probably a really good size for these buildings.
Yeah, I have read about different co-housing communities before, and I was just reading last night a book review about a book by Dr. Ruth, who died before the book came out, on loneliness, and how pervasive that is in our society. So this is really an interesting approach to housing, to try and, as you say, foster connection. But there were some big challenges too. I understand that there were 13 different layouts with everybody involved from the beginning, choosing what kind of spaces they wanted for their own individual units. So can you talk a little bit about the challenges that brought to the project?
Yeah, for sure. So I would say, because it's not a developer design build project, but we have the future occupants being part of the design clients. Everyone would like to obviously have their dream home kind of within that context, right? And so again, we were very lucky that we had a very, very good co-housing development consultant on this project, Renee Matthew, and she was able to help really, I call it channeling those different wishes. I came to the project a bit later in the process, so I can't quite speak to how these different layouts happened, but the assumption is that we kind of accommodated, when I say we, Cornerstone Architecture accommodated a lot of these wishes, right? And didn't really, it is really hard when you then say, well, it's going to be more expensive, because that's kind of common sense. If you don't stack units properly, then there might be more challenges. It was still, it's hard to tell at that point how much, right? Because that's usually the question. How much more expensive is it? So in the end, that's what it was. And that if we put this whole, because this discussion is all about affordable housing and how to create affordable housing ideally quickly, that would be one of the things where, if I would do this again, and I hope I will, I would really call it pushback, or really make it very clear that does not support affordability if you do too many individual layouts.
So I'm actually curious about the clients. You said it's 25 families. Do you know how did they all know each other beforehand? Like, how did this even come about? And then did they sit together and come up with a list of community spaces or a program that then Cornerstone, kind of developed for them? Or how does it work? How do you even start a co-housing community?
So there were quite a few people that kind of got together and came up with the idea. And then they hired this co-housing development consultant, and with her together, they kind of found more people that were interested and that then engaged into the project.
And then how did Passive House come along? Like, who expressed that? Was it the clients, or was it Cornerstone who said it needs to be a passive house?
It was the client. The client really wanted sustainability all the way through. So not only kind of sustainable community building, but also sustainable building. So the very, very most stringent building standard. that would support resiliency. So that was great because at Cornerstone, there are clients that come to us because they want passive house, but a lot of times we kind of push for that. Sometimes we just do it without letting them know because we just feel it's the right thing to do. Yeah. But in this case, it was actually the client, which was, again, wonderful, right? So there's no, it eliminates a lot of discussions.
In your construction approach, there are so many details that we could talk about, but one of the things I was curious about, just in terms of like, once you had settled on the design, the approach, did you guys use any prefabricated components in the construction of the structure? And if so, was that chosen for shortening the construction time or what?
Yes, we did. So it was the building walls were prefabricated, and prefabrication is a big term. It has many levels. In this case, prefab was really just the walls, so the studs and the plywood that came prefabricated, and that was put together fairly quickly. And yes, the reason for that was cost and time, which kind of goes together. Yeah, and the wall assembly we used really lent itself well to doing that.
And just again, not to focus too much on the details, but I know you decided to insulate it from the interior rather than from the exterior, as often happens in multifamily buildings. Is that correct? And what led to that choice?
You're right. So the 2x6 walls were filled with insulation, and we had 3 inches of EPS foil faced. And that foil faced part was actually part of our air barrier. And then there was another layer of 2x4 insulated. So the reason was that it was actually quite easy to establish the continuity of the air barrier at the intersection of the floor and the walls. And then we had the 2x4 as an installation cavity. So that seemed to be, out of all the options we considered, that seemed to be the best wall assembly for this project in this location.
And then I think you also mentioned, I mean, you talked about the complexity of the project, and that the parties coming with very individual wishes probably was a factor that it became a little bit more complex than maybe it should have. And one reason or one result of that was a more like the shape of the building went from a very compact building to something that wasn't quite as compact, and that had quite a bit of implications for your passive house or meeting the passive house targets in terms of insulation thickness and all of that. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that is correct. So because of the U-shaped building, our AV ratio wasn't the greatest, talking in passive house terms. So we had used this wall assembly on a previous, Cornerstone had used this wall assembly on a previous project, and it had a way better AV ratio. So on this one, because of the U-shape around this garden, we had to add another inch to the insulation, to the EPS insulation for this entire building, right? So that had quite an implication. But that's how it goes. The less compact, the more we have to make up for it somewhere else. Right? It's like we all know, like the passive house energy model, the PHP works like a mixing desk, right? In music, like you do something here and then you tweak something there, and somehow you get there. But obviously, thicker walls take away from the floor space, right?
How about windows? I'm always curious about like solar heat gain coefficients, because that's a big lever within that WUFI model as well.
That's an interesting point, I find, for multi-residential buildings anyway, because obviously there's different orientations to the building, and you can't just say, okay, I'll keep the windows small on the north and have them larger on the south, and then somewhere in between east and west. So that never works on multi-residential buildings. And then in an urban context, that's where this building sits. You can work with buildings, the surrounding buildings as shadow, casting shadow, whether or not there will be a future one. So that is obviously always the unknown. But windows weren't so much a problem. There's good windows out there. There's great glazing out there. It just really has to be modeled properly. Yeah. And then ideally, we have exterior shading, which seems to always be value engineered out first. So that it is a reoccurring, call it, challenge within the passive house construction. Should be exterior shading should be part of any construction, really, because it is the most efficient when it comes to shading and preventing solar heat overheating, solar heat gains. Yeah, but the windows weren't a problem. That was, we actually ended up not using certified, passive house certified windows. Some really nice windows. And
question about the solar heat gain coefficient. So sometimes, depending on how the building's oriented, according to the units, sometimes people go about like choosing different solar heat gain coefficients. Is that something that you looked at, or did it work?
Yeah. Oh, we did do that. We did do that. So there's like, even on the same elevation, depending on how high the window is installed, it's like the same window on top of each other. But as you go higher, there's less shading from the building, from the surrounding buildings. So it's different glazing, right? So yes, we did actually do that, and and then you just have to make sure that the right windows get installed in the right locations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that complicates things even more.
Yeah, it does. It is really. I mean, the side super. It all hangs on the side super, and really a good side super is essential.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you see a color difference between the different glazings, or does it all look cohesive?
Yeah, you see that.
Yeah, and that didn't bother you.
The architect always wants things unique, right? Then you want it to look all the same. But what's more important? I think preventing overheating and really kind of fine tuning the gains versus the losses is more important. Yeah.
When was the building occupied? How long has it been occupied? And have you gotten any feedback from the residents yet?
The building's been occupied since 21 already, I think. Yeah. And the feedback has been great. There are some challenges with certain items, and I'm not going to talk about that now, but that is always the case on any construction. But overall, the feedback I heard, I can't speak for the clients. I can just pass on what they told me, is they are very happy with the building.
They're still getting along.
They still seem to be getting along. I don't know if they would tell me if they weren't. So far I'm still the architect, so I don't know how far I get involved into these kind of things. But no, it seems very happy and peaceful whenever we go there.
And all the community spaces. I mean, the whole idea about community and having community spaces, that did work out, correct?
It totally works out. And it honestly, when you get in there, you go in and then you enter this big open lobby. And then right away, there is this massive amenity space, which is all interconnected on the ground floor, right? And everything feels so homey. I don't know how else to say it. It's not like a multi-residential building where everything's staged. This just feels like there's some scooters there, there's some shoes over there. I don't know. It feels warm and welcoming. Yeah, I'm repeating myself, but it does feel like a really great community. Yeah. Yeah. And then you have direct visual connection to the courtyard. So you have all of these ground floor amenity spaces are all surrounding this courtyard. And then you have more as you go up. Yeah.
And the amenity spaces, I think you briefly mentioned the roof deck. Can you elaborate on what's up there?
The roof deck has several raised garden beds for urban farming. Then there's some workbenches for pots and flowers. There's some seating areas up there. It's really another very large community space. Yeah.
And usually a lot of the roof deck would be taken up with mechanical equipment if it wasn't a passive house. Can you just talk briefly about what the heating and cooling and water heating systems and ventilation were?
Yeah. So the HRVs are all individual. So there's one small HRV per apartment. And then there's a few larger ones for the common spaces, but none of those require any massive mechanical areas. So that didn't take up much space. There is no mechanical equipment on the roof deck at all. There is a mechanical room. We have sand and heat pumps for domestic hot water on the ground floor. And did I forget anything? Yeah, no, this building does not have any cooling system other than there was a last minute decision after those 2 heat domes at the time. There is a mini split now in the one large amenity space. And the group is very, very happy about that. They did spend a lot of time in there during those heat domes in the past few summers.
Wow, that's great. That's like a group solution to how to deal with heat waves.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they also really, they have a parkade, but they always intended to not use it for cars. So that parkade is wonderful. It's painted white. And it just comes to my mind because it will be cooler down there also, right? And then in that parkade, there's the workshop, there is the music room. So that's another room that might be a bit cooler, and it's quite nice actually. It's a whole floor, also for kids to play when it rains, which it does quite a bit in Vancouver. Yeah.
I mean, obviously, this type of housing, the co-housing, absolutely addresses mental health for occupants and, in general, the mental health crisis, I guess. But how do you see it also addressing the shortage of housing supply? Like, how do you see that type of living, addressing the housing shortage?
I don't know if it would address the housing shortage and any different as other housing supply that would be built. What I would say is that this is a more sustainable approach to housing supply as it really kind of addresses the social aspect of creating housing, right? It's not just generating floor space to give people shelter. It really gives people a home with a community where they hopefully find a purpose and a sense of belonging. Mm-hmm. Again, going against this growing challenge of people feeling isolated and loneliness or feeling lonely. Yeah. Since we are having a housing crisis and there is an emergency and we need to build more housing, I would encourage anyone to build these kind of spaces, right? It doesn't take much. It does take a bit of a different approach, but it would go a long way. And to me, it's more sustainable and it will have a huge impact of our society. Because we are all humans, right? Society is human people, and housing is for humans, right? And when we want to belong, we want to feel connected.
Yes, I think it's a really great model for that, for feeling connected, and also for, supplying housing that has maybe more amenities than your typical suite or apartment might be able to give a family, yet not taking up footprint in the city, more footprint in the city per family as single family housing does. So it's a really interesting model. And although Cornerstone hasn't yet been involved in other co-housing projects since then, I just wanted to touch briefly on Cornerstone does often work on multi-unit residential buildings, correct?
Yeah, that is correct. Also, so in terms of multi-residential, the main building type we're doing in our office is really 6-story buildings, 6-story wood frame.
So as a firm, you said before, in terms of passive house, that's something that you would at least suggest, maybe even just do without people really knowing. Is this design approach maybe something that kind of changed the office's perspective a little bit as well, where maybe now going forward, even working with regular multifamily buildings, there could be a little bit more community space be integrated, just because you now know how important and how successful it is. Is that something that maybe that changed, the perspective a little bit, or the outlook of the firm?
Yes, for sure. I mean, we would always kind of suggest to create more amenity spaces. But it takes a certain client to really go for it. Like the typical developer pro forma it does include the amenity spaces that are required by design guidelines, but usually not more. And again, with the co-housing concept, it is one thing to actually provide the amenity spaces, but you also need the people to use them as a community and really kind of almost program this a bit, right? This whole setup of, okay, we're cooking together 3 times a week. This is like our schedule. It requires a bit of I don't know if management is the right term for this, but somehow the schedule has to exist, right? So people have to kind of take care of these things, that these group gatherings and these events will actually take place.
Well, but also as an architect, you can make those spaces really nice, so people really want to go there, or you just kind of fulfill, a program that's set up by the developer, and maybe put a kitchen in the back corner of the basement where nobody's going to go, right? So I think there is quite a bit of responsibility from the architect side. Yeah.
I mean, I've seen amenity spaces with hardly any windows, and I really it blows my mind, because this is really just fulfilling design guidelines, really just checking the box, but who wants to be there? This is not a space created for humans. This is a space created for floor space, because we have to have it. Yeah, that is correct. And the other part which really, really plays into this having more commonly used spaces is the other hot topic, single point access. Right? If that will become, hopefully we'll get there, will become mainstream, that really kind of supports healthier living, because we have less hallway space, we have more space that we can actually then use for amenity, not even rooms, but just gathering spaces. Like even hallways can have this. Like if you don't provide, as an architect, if you don't provide the space where people can meet, they don't meet. If it's a long dark hallway, I don't want to chat to my neighbor in a long dark hallway. If there's a nice little nook with a bench and I sit there, or somebody sits there and waits for someone else, then these things can actually happen. Yeah, so single point access would certainly support more connection.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast to talk about innovative approaches to housing. And I loved hearing about this project. And congratulations to getting the certification.
Thank you. And thanks for having me.
Thank
you. It was a pleasure.
And that was Sandra Rohler of Cornerstone. And great interview. Really enjoyed that. There's so much commonality with some of the things that is going on in my part of the world, particularly around one thing that jumped out for me was the issue of overheating and all the issues around that, thinking about different glazing up the side of the building. You asked about whether that had an impact on colour. It sounds like Sandra wasn't completely comfortable with the outcome, but it's a balance between the actual performance of the building, but just that concept of really getting specific. And I thought it was very interesting that some of the impetus of that was suffering through the heat domes and realizing, no, this is a real thing. We actually need to allow for this. And I know that a lot of people here and elsewhere are starting to use future climate files in their modelling and not accepting the current climate files, which is kind of based on historic data, and actually looking forward and saying, how is this building going to perform in 2, 3, 4 degrees warmer and for longer periods of warmer conditions. And looking at the images of this project, which we'll put some links to so that people can check it out, one of the things that jumps out straight away to me is shading and the fact that there are big overhangs and eaves and areas of shading. So it's clear that has been thought about. Ilka, what stood out for you?
Well, I think what you were saying about the shading and overheating, I mean, they don't have air conditioning in there, which was really interesting, right? It's built without air conditioning, but they have a common room that does have air conditioning. So I feel like that's such a good concept of kind of reimagining living together. It's not a single family apartment or a house, and nor an apartment where everyone just has their own unit. It's kind of the mixture in between, and really exploring that way of living with saying, okay, we have these community spaces and what can they do? And in terms of cooling, I mean, that became a room that was cooled and where people met during the heat dome. So I feel like just taking that as an idea of, okay, we have these extreme weather occurrences, and rather than just kind of putting AC into every room or every apartment where it's not totally necessary, but just focusing on these rooms that can be used in those occasions, and also just creating that community. I mean, just besides being efficient and sustainable, I mean, it creates areas for mental health well-being for the occupants. So I think that's a really, really important thing to think about as well, because that is also part of being sustainable, right? It's not just the performance of a building, it's also how do people live in these places, because only if they do well, they take care of them. So
yeah. I love what she said, housing is for humans, which sounds so simple, but really thinking about how the space is designed and making places intentionally that people will want to hang out in can really contribute to the ability to create a sense of community. It's not necessarily going to make it happen automatically, but as a designer, you can definitely encourage that to happen and not put up any unnecessary barriers to prevent people from socializing, getting together and forming that community, reducing loneliness, as you pointed out, and that sort of epidemic of loneliness in modern society. Zach, what do you think?
Well, I mean, just to elaborate a little bit on this point of that idea of the community room being this cooled space, it's sort of an extension of the community, or town kind of scale approach was just to have cooling centers, dedicated buildings or places that people can go to stay safe during these extreme events. And just not to put too fine a point on it, but the 2021 Pacific Northwest heat wave was, quote, the most anomalous extreme heat event ever observed on Earth since records began 2 centuries ago. That's according to the Washington Post. So, Lytton, BC in Canada hit 121.3 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 49.6 degrees Celsius.
Oh.
This is in Canada. The next day, it burned, that town of Lytton burned down. So, we are, I hope that we don't go through that kind of heat dome experience again anytime soon. But we definitely need to take them seriously and have strategies in place like that active cooling spot in the community room to deal with them for sure. So I think
that's getting right up there.
Yeah, it's insane. I mean, in the Pacific Northwest, it's cold. It's cool here typically.
Yeah.
It was just, totally bonkers. I guess the other thing that I was and Ilka, you got to this in the conversation a little bit, and was what can we learn from this co-housing experience and apply to other projects? And Sandra was rightly brought up the challenge, the inherent challenges of doing that when we're working with a developer who maybe isn't on board with the concept. But it is I know that co-housing just takes so much. You have 25 different clients in this circumstances, so it's just so intensive. And I've had a couple of friends who have gone through the process. One successfully, and the other where the process broke down because it took so long to make decisions, and you have to keep this community together throughout that whole process. So it'd be really great to take the learnings and the emphasis on connection and community and amenity space, and be able to apply those to a new project that it doesn't necessarily require that kind of intensive community work for years and years leading up to it. So that's just an interesting challenge. It's such an inspiring project. I think almost every time I hear about a co-housing project, I'm it's so impressive and exciting to see what these communities of people have built together and designed together. So it'd be cool to take some of those lessons and make sure and apply them, more broadly, with less investment of those years.
Do you have any thoughts on that, Ilka, about lessons learned that are transferable?
Yeah, I mean, I was actually wondering, why does it have to be a home ownership, right? Can it be a building that has units that can be rented and people can still use community spaces like that? I mean, why not? So then that way
Right.
You would have a developer or one owner, who can design it. I mean, I'm not sure if that is financially totally viable. Of course,
it is here. There's a growing interest. That's one of the fastest growing areas is build to rent projects, with quite large projects, and one of the most successful ones actually using superannuation, people's retirement saving funds. So there's sort of pots of money, and investors are seeing build to rent schemes as a good way to park that money for a reasonable long-term return on that capital. And that's working quite well. And you're right, it does. You can provide a lot of these communal spaces, but systematize the buildings, don't offer everyone their own floor plan design. It's kind of a much more take it or leave it kind of model, and people are taking it because it's a viable way of living. And it's also a recognition that home ownership is not the be all and end all. Living in a secure place with long-term tenure and a good environment is what people want. Home ownership is often seen as a wealth creation strategy as opposed to just a good way of living, and built-to-rent schemes is a way of breaking that reliance on this idea that you have to own a home.
Yeah, and I think what you're just saying about simplifying floor plans, I think that's probably the biggest takeaway that Sandra actually had, that this could have been a lot more efficient in terms of, the AV ratio, what we talked about before, but also just in terms of cost and maybe even speed of construction if it was more unified from the beginning. So I think, and that's probably the challenge, because if you have the clients who are going to be homeowners, they do have specific expectations, right? And they want them to be met if they put their money into it. So I do totally understand it, but I think in terms of streamlining this and making this a little bit more available in general, I think just streamlining the layouts is very important.
I mean, it reminds me of the prefab conversation too. When we can, have a set of plans that don't vary, then you can really, realize the economies of scale over time. There's some parallels.
Well, the expectations to have what did we talk about? The wardrobe, the clothes, the designer clothes versus something that you buy, right? So as a homeowner, you have those expectations of having designer clothes, but is that really necessary?
Yes. We're going to have to link to that great podcast episode where you and Mary had that conversation. Excellent.
Awesome. Good stuff. Great project. Go and check it out. There's some nice photos on the Cornerstone Architecture website, but also check out that live as well. We'll put a link to that and have a look at this project. It's well worth having a look at, and all of other Cornerstone's great work. Zach, what have we got coming up?
Oh, we have lots of exciting stuff coming up. So it's coming around the corner on this Wednesday, we have a Passive House Accelerator live episode with Ed May, improving our Passive House modeling tools. So that's on Wednesday, September 25th. And then on Thursday, September 26th, we are joined by Adam White of Intelligent Membranes, who is going to be presenting a component spotlight about Passive Purple External, which is an intelligent weather barrier. So he'll be talking about that technology and how it can be applied to passive projects. So we haven't had a component spotlight for a few months, so we're really excited to have this one, and we hope you'll join us there. And then on October 1st, we are opening our doors to our new membership community, the Reimagine Buildings Collective. This is where we bring together building professionals who want to step up and tackle climate change. So we'll include a link in the show notes to that as well. We hope you'll join us for that. And then on October 18th, we have a Reimagine Buildings virtual conference. Reimagine Buildings How to Decarb on October 18th from 11:30 a.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern. So we'll be looking at how to reduce upfront and ongoing emissions, how to build resilient, healthy havens, how to stop burning stuff and electrify, how to tap clean energy, and all sorts of other how-tos around decarbonizing buildings and making buildings that slash greenhouse gas emissions and make us more resilient to the impacts of climate change. So we'll include a link to that, and we hope that you'll join us. And if you become a Reimagine Buildings Collective member, the Reimagine Buildings conferences are free. So consider that. Thanks, everyone.
All right. If you missed all that, make sure you signed up to get newsletters from Passive House Accelerator, and you get all that updates and information. And thanks again to Stephen Winter Associates for supporting this week's show. They've been improving the built environment since 1972. Awesome work. All right. Thanks, Ilka. Thanks, Zach. And we'll see you again next week on Passive House Podcast.